Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone on behalf of the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm Kathy Mansfield. And tonight we have our webinar for this month brought to you by the Master of Arts in Financial Integrity program at Case Western Reserve University and the Northern Ohio chapter of ACAMS. Just to give you a little outline, I'm going to be introducing John Moody from ACAMS in just a moment, and he'll tell you what tonight's going to look like. And then I know some of you are intending to get continuing legal education for this program. And so at the end of the webinar, I will be both speaking and posting the event numbers so that you can go ahead and get your continuing legal education. Now I'd like to turn the evening over to John Moody. John is one of our instructors in the MAFI program and with Huntington Bank and also with the Northern Ohio ACAMS chapter. John, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome, everyone. What I want to do first is go over a couple housekeeping parts here. As participants, you're going to be muted from the presenters and each other. To ask your questions to our panel, use the Q&A, type in your questions there. What we will be doing with questions is holding them to the end of the panel speakers' presentation and then addressing those. Some of those may get answered through the presentation, and we will mark them as answered in the Q&A. And if you have follow-up to that, certainly input that question in. The chat will be used to inform you of any additional information. Additionally, we have ACAMS support here. Want to give a shout out for ACAMS Las Vegas. Their 20th annual is coming up on the 27th through the 29th. You can attend that virtually or in person. It's your choice there. If you're interested, go to acams.org and look to the events, and you can get the information about that conference. So I want to give a shout out to the Northern Ohio chapter of ACAMS sponsors. That would be Key Bank, PNC Bank, the MGM Northfield Park, AML RightSource, the Center for Intelligence Studies at Notre Dame College, and of course, Case Western Reserve University, Financial Integrity Institute, and the MAFI program. All right, it's my pleasure tonight to introduce William Brown, goes by Bill. He'll speak to us about the formation of financial crimes risk assessments that focus on anti-money laundering and the Office of Foreign Asset Control Obligations of financial institutions. And then our second speaker will be Willie Maddox, who will discuss how the AML, OFAC, and financial crimes assessments are successfully implemented and maintained at financial institutions. Bill's background is Chief Capital Model and Liquidity Risk Officer for Comenity Bank and Senior Director of the Risk Management Group at Alliance Data. His 25 years of experience in managing risk in financial service industry is a broad one. He brings a lot of information about the different financial institutions and BSA AML programs in finance, insurance, and the banking industry in general. With that, it makes him a very good speaker to tell us about risk assessment formation and how that's developed for financial crimes risk assessment. Willie Maddox is an Executive Vice President and Chief Risk Officer at Atlantic Community Bankers Bank. She joined that bank in 2019, oversees the risk and compliance function, chairs the bank's internal risk management committee, and is focused on evolving the company's risk management infrastructure and capabilities. She's also a distinguished lecturer at the of law at Case Western Reserve here in Cleveland, Ohio, and part of the MAFI program. So I'm sure many of you are aware of her and will be seeing more of her this weekend. So with this, I will go ahead and stop sharing and turn it over to Bill Brown, who's going to talk to us about the formation of risk-based financial crimes risk assessment. Bill, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. It's a big topic, so I'm going to dive right in. Our regulatory colleagues, and a lot of you are on the line tonight to really get some insight into how to satisfy a lot of those regulatory requirements around Bank Secrecy Act, money laundering, terrorist financing, financial crimes, and sanctions programs, and how to kind of navigate the regulatory waters around that. They ask that you have a program for all those things to meet requirements that are risk-based. Assessing your risk profile, make sure that you can appropriately have processes to manage those risks. And that is what our regulators are looking for. And they want to make sure that you can identify and mitigate any gaps in your controls. The risk assessment identifies both the risks, the categorization and quantification of them, the reporting of them, and how you manage those risks. The risk assessment should provide a comprehensive analysis of your bank's or financial institution's risks and discuss any other illicit financial activity risks. The assessment needs to be provided to everybody across the business lines, your board of directors, management, and appropriate staff. And that's the underpinning of a really good enterprise risk management program anyway. And very briefly tonight, as I discuss this, we'll talk about enterprise risk management and how both their functions can provide you information for the risk assessment, and as well as the BSA AML assessment, which we'll just call it, the financial crimes assessment, can help an enterprise risk management program identify other risks. And of course, Willie will get into a lot of that later, but we're going to talk about a little bit about it as we talk about development. The risk assessment generally involves the identification of some specific risk categories: products, services, customers, geographies, and sometimes, for you attorneys out there, some specific legal risks like sanctions or international transactions and the use of different legal requirements across them for BSA AML programs, and an analysis of information required to identify those risks within those specific risk categories. And we like to talk about these as a two-step process. There's an examination manual. The nice thing about building BSA AML programs is they're kind of open book tests, because there's a manual on how they examine those programs, and you can apply that. The FFIEC examination manual will give you kind of a manual on how to create a risk assessment, even a program, and what regulators look for when they dive into your program and look for answers. And the first step is to identify your bank's risk categories or your institution's risk categories. I try to stay out of banks because I've been in different industries where BSA AML requirements exist. And of course, if you're a law student or a risk management student or in the MAFI program, you might go to a different institution than a bank. Money laundering, terrorist financing, financial activities can occur through any number of different channels. Your assessment should address the varying degrees of risks associated with products, services, customers, and geographic locations. Improper identification of those risks can have a cascade effect. So if you're at an institution and you improperly identify a high volume activity or a high volume of customers as high risk, you can create a program that kind of overstretches looking at the forest for the trees. In other words, you end up with transaction monitoring that looks at huge populations of riskless customers. Or if you misidentify a small group or a geography that's extremely high risk, you can end up missing some of your highest risk activity. So you can see we're kind of identifying those sectors, let's call them sectors or processes or categories, however you like to define that, is really important. Identifying those risk categories is specific, and you need to have a conclusion about those risk categories in your risk assessment that are based on all the pertinent information. Now, we'll talk about this first phase just a little bit, because not only should that be quantified, but it should also be explained. One of the problems that regulators have when they dig into a risk assessment is there's all kinds of neat information and you have all the data in there, but sometimes there's not a conclusion. Why did you choose to make this high risk versus something else? And sometimes that can get you some comments. It can also create deficiencies in areas of internal controls. Remember, we talked about the forest for the trees issues, or missing a small population that can lead to missing a big risk. So we look at those indicators. So let's say we're going to look at transactions. The first step in creating risk, a risk assessment for anything is, I love to use this term, you have to see the whole enchilada. So you need to go out and assess your business. And that means going to all corners of the business and identifying all the places where transactions take place and identifying what kind of business you do in all of those spaces. And now imagine in a really large international company, that can be very difficult. But still, however we do that, you want to identify the types of activity that you conduct. Let's not even get into the step of quantifying it yet. Let's identify your products, your services, your customers, and your geographic locations. So you've done that. And you want to be specific, and you need to understand that any single indicator doesn't necessarily determine your low or high risk. So let's say you're looking at funds transfers and your institution doesn't do any international funds transfers. Well, that's lower risk, right? Well, no, you can still have some geographical risk in border areas or in areas where there's drug trafficking or even higher terrorist financing risk. So you don't want to use a specific category and just quantify that and say, oh, this is immediately high risk. Or let's say you do business in one small part of your company that has some real sanctions risks. I've been in the insurance industry and actually been in businesses that carry some real sanctions risks. And they were really tiny, but they can result in a lot of sanctions risk for you. Or you can look at that when you're finished and look at the management of those risks, and you can really tell your regulator, hey, we have a handle on this. We identify it, we know what it is, we have the appropriate controls in place. Now, there are sections in things about terrorist financing and the risks associated with money laundering publications that'll talk about information and discussion on products and customers and locations that you might want to really focus on for your risk assessment. Now, the second step of this is to create that broad risk assessment, isn't it? You want to evaluate some information and determine whether that works. And here's where it gets complex, because really the first thing I recommend is you sit down and write a methodology. A methodology will go a million miles with your BSA AML program in describing why you built it the way you did, how you're going to use interrelationships between products, services, customers, and geographic locations to comprehensively assess your risk. And it's going to show this is where we got our data from. This is where we got our information from. This is how we made sure that that data was accurate, timely, and complete. And here's how we used that data. And one of the other great things about a methodology is you can start to sit down with management and discuss how you're going to graphically represent those results. One of the neatest things you can do is have a well-quantified risk assessment with plenty of data in it. But when you get all that plenty of data done and you gather it together, some really strong graphical representations that tie sanctions and customers and transactions and services. So imagine a map where you can say, look at this overlap between sanctions risks and wire transfers and the use of funds and the type of high-risk customers that we have from our due diligence program. And look how they really overlap. Here's the red spot. This is where it's really high risk. So we're going to talk just a couple of minutes about gathering that data. You need to gather transaction data from everywhere. You need to gather customer data from everywhere. And you have to make sure that it's been tested. And here's where we talk about enterprise risk management programs helping you. You go out and you say, hey, have we tested the wire data and the transaction data and the customer data to make sure it's complete and accurate? So there you get to leverage your enterprise risk management program and say, hey, we have a good, data integrity program. So we were certain that that data is accurate. And you're going to gather that information, and you're going to look at all the kinds of transfers that are, all the transactions that are being done by those customers. You're going to look at where it's being done. And then you really spend some time sitting down and analyzing kind of those spots. And a graphical representation is one of the best ways to do that. It's being used throughout the industry for other types of complex risks. The other part that I'm going to talk about just very briefly is what do you really do with this? Do we do everything at once? And my answer to that often enough is yes. So yes, you include fraud in this, because when you look at the different types of fraud that take place and you look at where it takes place, you can start to identify maybe customers and entities that could be involved in it. You start to look at transactions that could be involved in it. And now you're getting to use transaction data that you use for your money laundering program. And you can actually start to look at it with all financial crimes and start to identify patterns that could help you get through your next regulatory exam, and also could save you several millions and zillions of dollars of financial crimes risks. Sometimes we want to use our money laundering program to satisfy those regulatory programs, but the real goal is to stop terrorist financing and narco trafficking and other financial crimes. So don't be afraid to create a risk assessment that includes data from across all of those lines and that addresses all financial crimes risks. That is a very accepted approach across the industry. Now, our regulatory colleagues like to see sanctions separated out. So they like to see that it's a financial crimes assessment, but they also do like to see a sanctions assessment kind of included with it. My organization has them all together, and we keep the sanctions piece of it separate. Once you're finished with that, you need to start to talk about how you're going in your methodology, how you're going to update it. You're going to risk assess it, and you're going to, our regulators do not have a required cadence for the assessment at all, nor do they have a required cadence for its refreshment. But if you have good data and you have good ways to pull it, it can almost be an evergreen document. And of course, as someone who's been through a number of regulatory exams in their life, an annual update on that is really best. And now we've talked about how to develop a risk assessment. And we're going to turn it over here in just a couple of minutes to Willie Maddox, who's a great risk officer. And she'll talk a little bit about how you take your risk assessment and move that into your enterprise risk management program and your BSA AML program. But first, we're hoping that there are just zillions of questions. Jim, do we have any questions?
As of right now, Bill, we don't have any.
Well, good. So I will use that as a segue. We'll keep going along, and I'll use that as a segue for Willie Maddox to start to talk about how we take a BSA AML risk assessment and implement it into the enterprise risk program and the BSA AML program. Willie?
Bill, very much. Welcome everybody and hello to you all this evening here. A wonderful evening to be talking about integrating AML, the risk assessments, and the cornerstones all around it. And what I would like to do is to kind of kick the conversation off because sometimes, and we have a vast amount of financial institution that range in various asset sizes. You have the small community banks, the regional, up to the real large kahuna types of banks. So depending on the size, that would dictate the complexity of the offerings that each of the banks offer, the approach that they would take with their risk assessments. For one of the examples I would like to share with you and how I've seen it done very effectively, and it also was very informative in the way that it was implemented, was that it was executed by the second line of defense, which is the compliance group or the AML group, if you will. They took the process, they own the process around it. However, we do know that the line of business, the front line, owns is the owner of the information, is the owner of the activities, therefore. So as part of the design to get it implemented, one of the best ways to do that, depending again upon your asset size, is to really sit down and plan it out. You just can't do it off of a knee-jerk reaction. You have to have some planning time spent with it, because typically for most financial institutions, they're going to be on a calendar year. And so you want your data to be allowed to run the 12 months, if you will, so if there's no gap in your data information. So the planning process typically might begin with beginning of or the middle part of the third quarter, with heavier activity kicking in around fourth quarter, but all coincided with prepping that data, because data is a very critical piece of information. That's what's going to be able to move through the various parts and pieces of other programs, your ERM program, and the other types of programs that you have, or that your company bank may have there. And with that, with the planning process, you want to be able to identify those critical stakeholders. And typically I've seen companies do town halls, and town halls previously, pre-COVID, those were separate kind of offsite. You just went somewhere locally and you had a conversation to start the conversation about things. And it was taken off site so that you can focus on the task at hand, so that you wouldn't have your phone readily available to you or be interrupted, because it really is part of a serious conversation that needs to be had. And it will take time through the planning process to get there. And as part of that kickoff type of activity, you identified your critical stakeholders. And what I've seen evolve more so, and it will continue to evolve, is the IT. Bill talked about, the data and the critical aspects of that. Having your data correct is really very, very important. And I know historically, the legacy of banking system, data has not always been accurate. Data has tended to be a problem, especially if you don't make an effort to, what I'm going to call, clean your data, because once you all know the tagline, bad data in gives you bad data out, right? So you want to make sure that your data is in the most pristine manner and accurate. And then you also need to identify, once you get your data, some teams, depending on how large they are, they have data, they perform data analytics, because as part of the process around all of this, you want to be assured that the data is validated. So it's always good to know who validated the data, who sourced the data, where did it come from? Because you want to be in a position when you are examined, either from an audit level or from your examiners, for them to be able to replicate your data. And sometimes this can present a major challenges for a bank where you cannot go back and replicate it, especially if you have bad data there. But you want that time to be able to do that. But then also identifying the roles and responsibilities, because I mentioned the second line of defense, you have the first line of defense, which is the front line. Everybody knowing their parts and their roles within that, and what pieces they need to deliver for those, for the risk assessment that needs to be done, typically for the year there. And then also as a component of it, that allows for the process of escalation, because you have many hands in the pots. And for some of the organizations that are larger, you're not only doing your risk assessment for your functional area, you have it aggregated and rolled up into many different layers. You could have one if you're on the consumer side, on the commercial side, on wealth management, and then it could rolls up to another higher unit until it aggregates all the way up to the corporate risk profile in and of itself. So again, the critical aspect of it is the data, but it also starts to tell a story behind it. It provides a narrative of the organization and its risk profile, some weaknesses where there might be, but also where it's strong at too. And then you can also look at the correlation of risk through the other aspects of the various programs through the enterprise risk management lens, the correlation to credit, the correlation to liquidity. And then also critically important too is the correlation to strategic and reputational risk. As you think about it and you look at sanctions, and if something were to be a mishap there, what that potentially could do to your organization. So that's a part of it. And I think also, as I've seen companies or banks do too, what you want to be able to come away with, and when you get to your analysis behind it, you want to be able to have consistency in your reporting piece behind it, because you don't want unit A to be doing it one way and then a different group doing it another way. So providing a standard mechanism by which the business units would execute it for consistency, right? So that you don't have apples and oranges when you start to do the analysis that way. Then that allows you to roll it up and also to trend the data, because within the risk profile, you want to be able to do this, and more than likely it's year over year. And so again, speaking to the consistency of it, and then for trending, then that helps the program at an enterprise level to see how things are truly happening here. Where do we have the most deficiencies? Do we have the right resources allocated in the right space, especially on the BSA side? Because if our risks are on international wires versus domestic wires, how are we supporting that? And if we have gaps that's come out identified from the audit or regulatory criticism, have we shored that up in a way that will sustain good results for us on a long-term basis there? So as part of this process, active communication is very critical on the program success. And it's not just the communication that's going to sit with the folks that are doing it, your subject matter experts. It needs to be part of a board committee, and also the board needs to be abreast of how things are going. And typically you're going to have that, especially when you have the Enterprise Risk Management Committee, which is the committee of the board, and then you have the board committee and the compliance committee too, because sometimes it goes there versus ERM. But long as it is communicated, the results and the progress are tracked, so that if there are deliverables that are missed, people take action for that. But it also could inform where there are challenges, where you may have a business unit that's more revenue-driven focused versus trying to really assess what's there. Because sometimes people still do have the mentality of compliance being a check the box. I'll check the box, I'm done. And I'm hopeful that we will continue to ebb and flow and shift the paradigm on that, because it really is more of a value-added services. It's more of a critical nature to talk about the impact to the organization strategically. And then these are just some of the inputs that would help drive that conversation further for us. Bill had talked about some phases, and I want to talk about some phases too around implementation of the risk assessment and how that would look, because we don't do it typically all at once because it's going to take some time. So the prep and the planning that goes into it will give you the results that you would expect. And if you rush it, you're not going to get a good job behind it. You're not going to have the analysis behind it. And maybe more importantly, you won't maybe even be in a position to stand and defend it to an examiner because your conclusions might have been a little bit faulty there because you rushed through it. So you do want to be able to take your time and assess it in the most appropriate way. And the first piece of this is usually you start with the inherent risk assessment. And what I've seen various institutions do is that they would carve out the three components. It'd be the inherent risk, your control environment, and then looking from those, your inherent risk minus your control environment gives you the residual risk. And is that residual risk within the stated appetite of that particular bank? And so as you go through those three, I'm going to parse out phase one for this one. Determining your inherent risk, inherently about your clients, about your products and services, the different channels. And looking at your channels, let's just pause for a moment there. How are you onboarding your clients? Are they coming in primarily face-to-face, but probably not so much in post-COVID here as we were in this phase here, or still in it, if you will. Or are you an internet bank? You don't have that face-to-face. So those two dynamics poses very different risk. And so the evaluation needs to go into that. And then also the geographies and looking at other types of qualitative information, such as the stability of your client base. Now, that stability of the client base also can impact you strategically and on a reputation wise, because if you're finding that your client base is eroding, why is that? So there is some implications there. Also, other qualitative factors that fit in here that should be looked at is are you going through an integration of your IT system? Are you having some conversion? And have that been planned out accordingly? Or are there some real challenges behind that piece of it with your data component there? And then looking at also your revenue growth there. And also another big nugget around this piece of it, if you look inherently, is the reliance on third-party vendors. As I know on the community bank side, on the smaller side, there is a heavy dependency on vendors to perform some of their tasks because many of those are outsourced. But still, even if it being outsourced, that bank still owns the risk for that particular activity that is being outsourced there. So there are some things that are inherently that you need to take a look at it. And when I say that, I think most of you know that is without any controls. So you can't apply it on, well, this is high, but because we do A, B, C, and D is at a moderate or low. No, inherently it means without any controls being applied. So if you didn't have no protective guardrails there, what would that look like for you? And assess it very honestly, because then you apply the controls a little bit later on down the road there. But then looking at what new, as you build out and perform your risk assessment, what new products and services did you add for the year? Did your business model change? What new initiatives have you deployed through the year? And then making an assessment about that. So those all go into the factor of around your inherent risk. Then you get to looking at your assessment of controls. Now this is where this could give some folks heartburn, okay? Because this is also where you get to see how you have performed relative to your examiner's criticism and how you have performed against your internal audit, your audit findings, right? So if your control environment is weak or there's a gap in it, you're going to have some findings. And the findings would need an action plan and it would need to be mitigated. My big thing is if you have findings, it can be informative, right? You can learn from that. But if they're repetitive, this is what can get you into trouble. But better than the second line defense finding them or the third line, actually the second line is better than the third line finding them from an audit perspective, is to self-identify your issues, right? Because you do have to recognize that and apply that assessment of those to your control environment. So either your control environment could be strong, it could be weak, or it could be okay. But then if it's okay, then what are those opportunities for enhancement down the road to that? So it's looking at the potential of, if you're weak or you're just okay there, you know, what is your exposure that you could have a failure point on your money laundering program, on your BSA program, on your sanction screening, you know, if you're just getting by without always looking at it and tuning it to move it down the road. But that is what would be applied within your internal control environment in a way. Now, as we think about it, what also you look at as you're going through your risk assessment process is, how are your policies and your procedures, the management oversight of that, your MIS reporting. So all of these things takes into account these activities here, and hopeful that you are reporting out to your senior management team, to your business leads, and then, you know, going up to the board committees, even your own internal committees here, so that they are informed of the progress, they are informed of issues and challenges. So again, that resources can be applied in a very meaningful way for the organization. Or if this tight because of budget, a shifting of resources based upon the priorities of how things are showing up for you in your organization. But then also, I guess it does have a piece of it as you look at the detection of your SAR filing. So are there any issues coming out of that, because it's not set up properly for that? So the goal overall, when you think about, I'm going to call it phase 2, around your internal control, your control environment, it really is to assess the overall design and operating effectiveness of your controls. And if it's coming up short, then what are those mitigating factors that you can apply that will remediate those particular activities, and then sustain it long term, right? Because you don't want a quick fix. You want to be able to put the right remedy on it that will sustain you going forward. And then from that, then you will get into the residual risk, and that leads you to where you are on your risk appetite spectrum. Now, for enterprise risk management and for some institution, they apply it within the functional groups, and then also at a corporate level. So at a corporate level, you could say overall, our risk appetite level is moderate across the business. We're not ultra conservative, but we also are not taking on a lot of risk. So we're just kind of middle of the road there. And with that, so overall, the risk appetite could be moderate. But then you look into your functional areas or your major risk categories around credit, liquidity, market, interest rate risk, compliance, operations, strategic, and reputational. Those could have various degrees of risk appetite that has been approved by the board, and then they produce accordingly as long as they stay within that. But those on an aggregate level then gets to be at aggregate up to that moderate level there. So it's just making sure that things are working as intended, and then you're making the right decisioning around those pieces of it. Now, as part of too, as you are implementing and you're thinking about your risk assessment, one of the things that come out very often is the analysis of your customer. And I remember this one institution I was with, I really liked how they did this, because they really cut that customer up from the data point. They looked at the length of the relationship of that, and it was in like 4 buckets. So it really got you to see, where are the majority of your clients? Are they in a 0 to probably less than a year, 0 to 3, or 3+ to 5, 5 to 7, greater than 10, greater than 15 years. So it lets you know the stability of your client, because I think that has some attributes that's very positive in that nature. But if you're seeing too that we have a lot of churning going on from the 0 to the 3, then what's going on with that? It begs the question, strategically, is that the intent of the entity? Is that your strategic goal is to churn, or what are you doing there that's causing it? Or there's some other underlying reason that could be tangential to some other thing that's happening that you're not aware of. But I think the analysis can help speak to that. How many accounts does the customer have? Then how many customers are associated with that account? Because again, looking at the stability within your customer base, and then your channels we talked about a little bit earlier, internet, face-to-face, the phone, how are your customers coming in? And then Bill spoke about the geography of the country, looking at that, because you also want to see where your transactions are coming from or where they're going to on a domestic international basis, and looking at your dollar volume and the volume and the dollar amounts there. But then also let's talk a moment about the OFAC piece of it, because this is also part of the statistics that should go into your risk assessment. You know, how many false positives are there that you experience? And I think once we look across the board, and if you're doing it by your major groups or your functional areas, you know, it could be that, you know, commercial bank doesn't have as many, but on the commercial side, you see this really trending high number there. So it kind of begs more research to be done in that, or more conversations about why that is happening. But then also looking at, you know, how many positive OFAC hits that you have. So is things operating as intended around it, or is there some exposure there that we need to shore up and to mitigate? So what I would say too is, as we look at the different phases of the risk assessment, that I kind of described it that way, it provides greater transparency when you're implementing it into accountability, because you don't have none of this going on. Well, I thought you were doing, I thought you had it. It eliminates all of that because you are reporting your progress. And as the progress continues to get reported through senior management, up through the board committees, and up to the board, you have people held accountable for that. And then if it needs to escalate, then that's the mechanism for things to start escalating. So it gets behind the things that could be identified as challenge, or if a business is just not paying attention, right? You say this is due by, you know, November 30th, and they haven't even started the process yet. So it takes care of that with that. But the backdrop of some of this too is the data and it's condition of your data, because I know historically it has been a major challenge for institutions that has legacy data that way, who has not wrestled with it or resolved that problem there. So let's just pause for a moment and talk about in planning for your BSA, AML, OFAC, and your sanctioned risk assessment. Proper planning is paramount. Informing your stakeholders that they're going to be engaged and what's required of them is of utmost paramount, and give them time to gather the data, to analyze it, because once you do that, then you'll be able to really carve into your customer base, look at your markets, look at your products, look at your services, to identify those, out of those things that can cause heightened BSA, AML, OFAC risk for you, your exposure there. And then also use your statistical and or your transactional data, especially on the large complex side, to identify, you know, what that looks like within your risk profile in and of itself. So again, you're really looking at, you're honing in on your products and services, you're honing in on your customers and your entities, such as your cash intensive businesses, your PEPs, your politically exposed person, personal investment companies, professional services providers, whatever those are that's deemed to be high risk from the FFIEC guidance there. And then also geographic locations. And then just the distribution within that. Now, Bill mentioned a great resource for everybody to take a look at, and that is you have the open book. So if you're taking a test and you have the open book, there's no reason at all, people, to fail, right? There's no reason to fail at all. So if you look at that and when you're doing your evaluation, you should be able to come out, I would say, take it as a cheat sheet and say, okay, we just completed our risk assessment for the year. And before we even go to have it approved, which it needs to be approved by your board and through the various committees, before you even do all that, say, did we determine that the bank identified money laundering, terrorist financing, and other illicit financial activity risks associated with our products, our services, our customers, and the geographic locations that's unique to our bank? Did we do that? And if you can say yes to that, then move on to the second one. Did we determine that our bank analyze and assess the money laundering and terrorist financing and other illicit financial activity within that. So the risk within that, do we do that? And if you're good there, then move on to the next one. Did we determine as a bank that we have a process for updating our BSA AML OFAC risk assessment as necessary? Now, as necessary to reflect changes in our bank's products, services, customers, and geographic locations. And it remains to be an accurate reflection of our bank's money laundering, terrorist financing, and our other illicit financial activity risk. So did we do that? Now that's a big kahuna around that one. So when we did that update there, did we note those reflections of changes? And then the last piece of it here as a clip note is, did we as a bank document? Did we document? Did we document people? And we discussed this with our management, our board committees, and the board, and it is noted and memorialized within the respective minutes of each one of those. And then addressing any findings that came out of the BSA AML risk assessment process. So that's what I wanted to kind of share with you tonight. This also, as Bill had mentioned, it bleeds over into the enterprise risk management. Because as you pull up on that and you do the enterprise-wide risk assessment, you're going to do them typically for each of your major categories. And depending on if you are an OCC bank, you will have certain risk categories, and versus if you are a Federal Reserve Bank, there are other certain risk categories. But each of those defined by the institution would have what they call is their major risk category. And then AML BSA is an integrated piece of that, because collectively you're looking at it, because you're not looking at it in silos. And because that's one of the beauties of enterprise risk management, it takes you out of being siloed. So if you were to examine, if you look at and you're managing on a functional basis, credit, market, ops, compliance, strategic, reputation, you're managing that on a silo basis. But the beauty of ERM, it takes it all, it aggregates it all up so that you can start to see the correlation, where risks are, where does it bleed over, where does it touch, so that if it impacts credit, does credit impact BSA AML? And I would say that as strategic, it could be very true, because we don't have this on our topic tonight, but if you think about some of the de-risking activities that financial institutions are going through, and they have been doing this over the past few years here, that impacts, because you could say from a money laundering exposure, AML exposure, this bank presents too much risk, or excuse me, this customer presents too much risk to this organization, and they are outside of our risk appetite. And so then you start to de-risk them, move them off of your balance sheet, move them out of you exit the relationship, or you exit certain risky parts of the relationship. So that's a major thing to think about there. So I will leave you with that. And I think I'm at my time here. So thank you.
Great, Willie, thank you very much. And to both Bill and Willie, there's a question out here. Actually, we got a couple of questions. The first one is, what automated platform would you recommend to support your enterprise risk management efforts to manage the data within the same platform?
That's a pretty good question. You know, I think what this lens is more towards, and this is kind of, I have a couple of things to add this evening. I didn't know where to put them, is what person would you have manage that? And BSA AML groups, they need a couple of statisticians nowadays, real data analysts, people who can use SAS and SQL, and it really doesn't matter. You're getting the data from your transaction systems. So as a model guy, I have, you know, and when I was in the business of doing risk assessments, I would get a couple of statisticians and we would build big workbooks in SAS and SQL directly from the transaction monitoring systems. and from the transaction systems themselves. And as addendum to the risk assessment, I could hand those libraries of code over to our regulators, and I would go ahead, run them. You'll get the same result. So that's one thing that you can get from that. And the other thing you'll get from it is an evergreen BSA AML process. It's a lot of work. And yes, you're going to need to hire a modeler and a real statistician. But when you're done with that, any time of day where you want to see how many wires went to Fiji at 3:45 p.m., you can get that data and the code's already written. So my answer to that is library your data from your transaction systems and your transaction monitoring systems, whatever they may be, and keep workbooks of code in whatever statistical platform you choose. I like to use the general word SAS to address that. Was that a good answer? Does that help everyone?
Great. I do think that helps, Bill. There's a kind of a follow-up question to both you and Willie with respect to cooperation from an enterprise-wide perspective with the respective lines of business. We all know that oftentimes banks are running so fast and the respective lines have their own priorities and timelines and things of that nature. So part of this question goes to new product rollout, where a new business product is being literally pushed out so fast that there's not a lot of time to address the risks behind it. And so in regard to identifying those risks, did you advocate or believe that a decentralized type of risk assessment is more effective than a centralized model of risk assessment to get to more effectively identify the overall risk?
I would answer that differently. Because the first thing that comes to my mind is, why do you not have a seat at the table in some form, or someone from your area, your group, so that you are abreast as they are making these discussions, making these strategic efforts around the development of these new products and what the rollout's going to be? Because that way you're riding right alongside, and it's more of a partnership with the business to point out the risk and the pros and cons of going down that path versus getting it more after the fact. So I'm a big proponent of that, and in whatever manner that you can be able to shift the course of events for you that way, that would be my preference. I don't think it's so much central or decentral as I think it is more strategically having a seat at the table, being part of those relevant conversations.
Okay.
In time when they're happening.
Okay, perfect.
I can add to that answer just really briefly, in that remember that an important part of your risk assessment, and something we should touch on for just 1 minute, is your coverage assessment. When you're done with your risk assessment, there needs to be an addendum to your risk assessment that has every bit of your transaction monitoring and all your controls. And you have to match up the risks with whether or not you're monitoring and providing transaction monitoring and customer due diligence support for all that activity. That's pretty difficult to do if you're not centralized. At big banks, you have to do it decentralized because your bank in Poland can't even tell you what kind of customers they have sometimes. But as best as you can, when you create your coverage assessment, which is a critical part of the risk assessment, you cannot leave behind any stone. So if you're completely decentralized and you lose one of those business units, you miss that in your coverage assessment.
Okay, super answered by both of you. That's very helpful. We do have, for sake of time, we have a couple of questions. Maybe we can give some quick answers to these. The first question is, who actually gathers the data for risk assessments in your institution? Compliance or a separate risk management function?
I'm going to say it depends, because it also depends on the size of your organization, because you do have some units that are set up with their own data analytics team. And so that team is equipped to do that versus another one, they don't have that. And so they rely on IT to get it for them. So it's going to be, I don't think it's one size fits all in that particular example.
Okay. The next question is, when conducting risk assessments, do you favor a qualitative or quantitative method?
That's an easy answer. Well, I can do that in 30 seconds, which is
Let's
both.
go.
Both are required. You must have a quantitative methodology. And remember, I talked earlier about methodology. Your specific quantitative methodology should be spelled out. But golly, we math people, we don't have all the answers, right? So we have to look at it from a qualitative perspective and make good decisions based on the data that we've given that give us the right answer. So both. And both are actually spelled out in the FFIEC manual. You must have this and you must have that.
If you don't, you open yourself up to regulatory criticism.
Yep.
Okay, one last quick question. Let's see if we can blow through this in about 2 seconds here. Risk assessments sound like a very complicated, extensive process requiring multiple parties and continual interaction among them. Is this something all sizes of financial institutions can reasonably aspire to?
Community banks need to have a quality BSA AML risk assessment, and so does Citibank. The good news is it's easier to do it at a community bank. You can walk down the hallway and get your wire data. So yes is the answer. A quality risk assessment sometimes doesn't have to be a big one. It just has to be a good one. So yes, we should always aspire. And let's talk about ERM for 10 seconds. Your enterprise risk management program should be really high quality and assess all your risks all the time. It's just easier because you're a smaller institution, right?
All right, great, good. Willie and Bill, thank you so much for your questions. We have no further questions.
Thanks for having us.
John, are you jumping back in for a minute?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Bill. Thanks, Willie. Great presentations there. I think there were a couple questions I could ask, but we had some good questions there and you gave good coverage. So with that, I want to just go quickly into, if you're part of the ACMS organization, and especially if you're a member of the Northern Ohio chapter, please make sure you've updated your profile with any contact changes, information changes. That's how you stay in the loop. And if you're a chapter member, send us an email with any changes to your contact information, and we'll get you updated on our lists. With that, looking forward, the next chapter MAFI event will be October 21st, and just look for the communications on that coming up.